There we go. We are recording in progress. All right. We're a small group, so it can be as informal as you want or as formal as you want. Our topic tonight is the origins of the Cold War. But I'm going to start with a slight preamble. Just 1 second here. Rosanna, they want you to step in front of the camera because some of them haven't met you before.
Oh, okay. Hello, how are you?
Hi, nice to meet you.
The same.
Good to see you tonight.
All right. We have all been met. Okay, our topic is origins of the Cold War, but I'm going to start off with a preamble. Whenever I have to talk about the Cold War, I have to recognize the whole purpose of this project is to look at the history I've lived through and that has shaped my life and my attitudes. And really, there are two countervailing forces that have shaped the way I look at the world. One is the Cold War, and one is that 1960s reaction to the Cold War, the counterculture. And I am a child of the counterculture, which means there was a divide in America, much like there's a divide today. Only the divide there was those who believed in the Cold War mentality and the counterculture, which was appalled at the Cold War, which was appalled at the madness of the arms race, our involvement in the quagmire of Vietnam, in the paranoid excesses of McCarthyism, and of all kinds of events like that, of the nuclear brinkmanship of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we kind of looked at the world as an unnecessarily dangerous place with fools running the show. That having been said, I also have to look at the Cold War. I have to, I had said we were going to look at the events of my lifetime. The origins of the Cold War is not the origin of my lifetime. It's 44 to 47-ish. I was born in 53. The Cold War is the world that my father's generation bequeathed to me. And as critical as I am of it, what is equally important is that I come to understand it. Because I think it's a general pattern of history. We're going to talk about the origins of the Cold War tonight. Well, one of the things in the origin of the Cold War is my father's generation was looking back to the generation of World War I and the failures of the Treaty of Versailles, and they're being very, very critical of them about all the mistakes they made, that if World War I had been ended better, we would not have had the Great Depression, and we would not have had the inevitable ascent into World War II. I mean, most people look at World War I and World War II as part A and part B. They're all part of the one long war. And that's because in FDR's understanding, they didn't understand or they didn't make good decisions about creating conditions which would break the cycle of war and poverty. And what he wants to do post-World War, and he doesn't live to do it, what he would like to do is to end that cycle, to look at what the problems were by the generation of World War I, not make those same mistakes, correct those mistakes, and then move forward. Then you get my generation. We look back at the people who started the Cold War and say, look at the mistakes they made, look at the terrible things they did. And if I were to bring my daughter into this room, she would tell you what mistakes my generation has made. She would look at climate change. She would look at the rise of white supremacy. She would look at all of these problems that we are leaving on the plate for her generation to fix. And what I would say to her is, wait for your kids. They're going to point back to you and say, look at the mess you made of this world. I would have done it differently. This is what you should have done. And it just seems to be a pattern of history. And it's not so bad because there are really two things you need to do when you do this. And it's really one of the reasons for my doing this exercise. It is A, to know what happened and critique it. This was wrong. This shouldn't have happened this way. This could have been done better. But the also is to understand it. Understand what forces there were that created the bind that they were put into, that made them make the decisions that they made, just as my generation has made its decisions and mistakes, and my daughter's generation will do the same, because that's what human beings do. Anyway, that's my preamble. I am outside of what I said the purpose of this 3-year project was, which was to look at the history of my lifetime. I got to look at my dad's lifetime first, and what his generation bequeathed to us. And again, if I were to live another 100 years, I would start looking at my generations and its mistakes, and we could go on down the line because we're all going to make those mistakes. Okay, that's the preamble. Now, to get started, what we have to recognize as we're looking here is the Cold War and the end of and the fighting of World War II are really part and parcel of the same thing. FDR and Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, the big 3 leaders, all had a dual purpose in mind as they fought the war. 1, win the war. 2, win the peace. And winning the peace was almost more important than winning the war. Wouldn't want to go as far as say that it was more important, but almost. It was because winning the war, winning the peace means setting the conditions for the post-war world that will break this cycle of constant war, constant poverty. I mean, if we think about what happened between World War I and World War II, what we saw was the rise of fascism. And one of the things that FDR is going to say, you know what, if we do this badly, we'll see a rise of some similar movement, fascism, some form of totalitarian authoritarian, I'll get that word out, regime, and that we have got to do better than our parents did. And so that is winning the peace is really what the Cold War is about. Only I would suspect that it didn't work out so well, not the way they wanted it. We had 50 years of Cold War with a lot of hot wars, proxy wars fought during it, whether it's interventions into Latin America, whether it's the war in Korea, the war in Vietnam, the forever wars in the Middle East. We have been at some sort of constant state of military involvement, military intervention, flat out wars for almost my entire life. There's a brief respite from 1989 for maybe the first part of the Clinton administration. And then all of a sudden we begin to get a war on terror, and that has had its own iterations again and again and again and again and again. At any rate, what we're going to look at is in 1941, the big 3 formed an alliance. They were in this together to win the war and win the peace. But by the end of the war, they were at each other's throats. They didn't like each other, and you began to see it break down. And that's what we're going to look at, how this broke down. Again, all of these things went not the way they envisioned them. Remember, at the end of World War I, Wilson said, we're going to make a world safe for democracy, a war to end all wars. Well, that's what FDR wanted. He didn't come close. Of course, I have to say FDR/Truman because Truman takes over, but none of the big 3 got what they wanted out of this. They got a long, hard, and difficult and expensive Cold War. And when you think about a Cold War is important not just because of the foreign policy. It's also because of its impact on the domestic life, the daily life of the citizens. We had McCarthyism and all kinds of difficulties. Again, for those of us who grew up in the 60s, we called it the generation gap, but it was very polarizing. And if you were on the side of the counterculture, you're told love it or leave it. If you were on the side of the Cold War, you're called a warmonger. We didn't like each other, and unfortunately, those divisions still exist today. One of the things that we have to understand here, and sometimes Americans do not like to hear this, if we want to think about who won World War II, who defeated the Nazis? I'm going to leave Japan off to the side. Who defeated the Nazis? The Russians did. The Russians bled the Nazi army dry, while at the same time being bled dry themselves. The Russians lost somewhere between 20 and 25 million people in World War II. To put that in perspective, American losses were about 500,000. And Roosevelt and Churchill both knew there's no winning this war without the Soviet Union. They were doing the lion's share of the fighting and dying. Britain played a major role in the first couple of years of the war, 39 to 41. They kept Western democracies alive. They were standing up to the Nazis, not beating them, but at least holding, treading water, waiting for the other two to join. Finally, the Russians joined, and then the Americans joined. And what America contributed to the war, yes, some fighting and some dying. But what we really contributed that really made a difference is financing and industrial capacity to build planes and tanks and whatever the war machinery needed. No country in the world could come even close to us. I don't remember the statistical numbers, but it was something on the order of before America got into the war, England was able to build 1.5 planes a month, something like that. America, in its first month of production, was producing like 20. And each month it moved up exponentially and exponentially and exponentially. We were the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt wanted us to be. That was our major contribution. But the dying and the killing of Nazi soldiers, that was the work of the Russians. And FDR knew it, and so did Churchill. And so we appeased and compromised with the Russians, even though there were things. I mean, if you think about American history from the end of from 1917 with the Russian Revolution, we hated the Russian Revolution. We did not recognize Russia as a country until the mid-30s. We had in our own country the Red Scares in the 1920s. We thought there was no such thing as a good communist, whether it's at home or abroad. And so we did not trust them. We did not like them. And yet in this battle against Nazism, against fascism, it is essential to have the Russians there, because we could, not that we couldn't defeat them, but to defeat them, we would have to be willing to pay a price similar to what the Russians paid. And again, think of that, 20 to 25 million casualties. That is an ungodly number. At the center of this is figuring out what the peace should look like. I mean, when we think about World War II, there were at least a dozen conferences of the big three. First, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, and then Truman taking Roosevelt's part. And the lion's share of what they talked about was not the policies or strategies for the war. It was, what are we going to do next? How do we order the world after that war? And so in order to do that, you have to say, well, World War I was a mess. And the aftermath of World War I was about one of the worst periods in human history in terms of suffering. The Great Depression, and then right into World War II. And again, I just want you to think, World War I had 20 million casualties. World War II had over 50. I mean, we are in a place where we cannot imagine, where the world could not imagine that you could have atrocities like this. And actually, as the war ends, we are not that far away from World War III. We are about to turn on our enemy and say to the Soviet Union, you either back off or we're coming after you. And they were ready to say the same to us. But there's one difference. If there were 50 million casualties, more than 50 million casualties in World War II, we now have the atomic bomb. How many casualties? An unthinkable number. I mean, one of the questions almost needs to be asked as you start a discussion like this is, why a Cold War? Why not a hot war? And the answer is the atomic bomb. Okay, we'll continue and you can pick up. Atomic bomb threatened so many deaths. Just reminded in an absurd way, there was a story about Mao Zedong. He was on a train with a whole lot of reporters, and the reporters were and politicians, and the reporters and politicians were talking and saying there will never be a nuclear war. And Mao said, why? And they said, well, can you imagine 50 million casualties in World War II? What's the number going to be in World War III, an atomic or a nuclear war? And they said, just no country would do that. And Mao Zedong is supposed to have looked over and said, we could do it. China could afford those losses. Oh, we lost 50 million people. Well, I don't know what their population was then, but it's over 1 billion now. 50 million would have been a big loss, but manageable. And but for the rest of the world, to talk in death tolls of that number was absolutely unthinkable. Okay, so the first thing we've got to do if we're going to work out the peace is we've got to agree on what mistakes were made and how to fit and what the best solutions are for them. And the problem is FDR and the United States had one list of what the problems were, and Stalin had another list. They couldn't agree on what the problems were. And if you ask them for the solutions, they couldn't agree on them either. And you have to understand the precariousness of this relationship. If you were to speak to Winston Churchill, and he was a rather blunt fellow, he would have told you right out, the Nazis are a problem. A communist expansion is this equal horror for the world, an equal threat to democracy. He didn't trust the Russians. He didn't like the Russians. He needed the Russians because you can't defeat the Nazis without them, but he didn't trust them for a second. And the minute that war was over, he would be ready to turn against them. If you look at the United States, we hated communism too. But we really needed the Russians to help, not to help, to do the bulk of the fighting. Now, if you want to look at what was the problem for Stalin with the United States, Stalin had been promised when the United States entered the war that we would put up a second front. And that was, and we would, this was obviously D-Day, I mean, not D-Day, Pearl Harbor was 1941, December 7th. And we said we'd have that front going early in 1942. Well, that front did not materialize until 1944 with D-Day, June 6th. Now, during that time, the Russians were losing tens of millions of men. And he's looking at the West and saying, if you can start your fight, if you can start a front there, the Russians, the Germans will have to siphon off a large part of their army to come and fight you. And we'll share the dying. We'll kill Nazi soldiers and so will you. And we'll have some of our men killed and some of your men killed. But we didn't. Again, we took more than 2 years to get a front together. And he was furious at that. He also believed that at the end of the war, he couldn't trust Great Britain and the United States, that they might very well pool resources and turn against the Soviet Union. And he had good reason to think that, because they were thinking those thoughts at the time. Because again, the great distrust. So that's how precarious their relationship was while they're fighting a joint war where they have a common enemy. What happens when the enemy is beaten? When you don't have a common enemy and you don't like each other and you don't trust each other, when you have very different visions of what you want the world to be like, how the hell do you agree on anything? And the answer is they could all agree on almost nothing. They would get kind of vague agreements and say, we'll kick it down the road and we'll work out the details later, but they couldn't really solve anything. So if somebody had been in the business of predictions, they would have said, as soon as this war is over, that alliance is going to fall apart and it's not going to take long. And they'd have been absolutely right. That alliance was not going to hold. There was just no way. Again, they didn't like each other. So step one, what are the problems? What are the mistakes we need to fix? FDR identified 4 problems with the Treaty of Versailles. Number one, we needed this time around to demand unconditional surrender. Now, we didn't demand that in the Treaty of Versailles. And unconditional surrender means the defeated enemy is going to know they were defeated. They will be occupied by an occupation force. In this case, it would be a combination of French, British, Russian, and American troops. And we would completely dismantle their industrial capacity to rearm. And we didn't do that at the end of World War I. And the result is Germany rebuilt up its military capacity. And by the time World War II comes along, they're able to run over France, run through Poland, Czechoslovakia. They've got a powerful military. And one of the things that Roosevelt says is, can't let that happen again. Their capacity to build arms has to be completely dismantled. Okay, that's the only thing the Russians are going to agree with FDR on. The second one, the economic conditions at the end of World War I were disastrous. All of the countries of Western Europe, their economies were in turmoil. There were people starving. It was a horrible situation. And it's going to grow and grow and grow until we blossom into the Great Depression. And one of the things that is true is, you want to find people turn to radical solutions to their problems, give us a depression. When the economy goes bad, then people lose faith in democracy, lose faith in reason, and say force works. And that's the rise of fascism. And so what you got to do is, at the end of the war, you got to make sure the economies are rebuilt. I mean, we do the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan wasn't an altruistic act. Well, there's elements of it that are altruistic, but it was a recognition. If you do not rebuild, what you are doing is sowing the seeds of the next war, sowing the seeds of great poverty, and it's all going to be, you're going to pay for it in the end, is going to be awful. We will get World War III. It might take a gap of 15 years again, but in the meantime, it's just going to be like a continuation of what the first half of the 20th century was like. World War, depression, World War, depression, World War, depression. You can't allow that. So what you've got to do is rebuild those economies, and you've got to open up world trade markets, lower trade barriers, negotiate multilateral trade agreements to make sure that every country is involved in the economy and is able to stay afloat. Now, to that end, one of the mistakes made in World War I that he said we cannot make now, we can't demand punitive reparations from Germany. In order for Europe's economy to be healthy, you need a strong German economy. You destroy the German economy, and the whole economy of Western Europe is going to fall apart. So you can't demand of them more than they can afford to pay. Are there going to be some reparations demanded? Absolutely. But somebody else is trying to get in. Well, somebody else will get in a second, and at any rate, we will continue. At any rate, so there is that need to treat Germany not punitively, but reasonably, and allow their economy to grow, but without the industrial capacity to create arms, to rearm themselves. And the final thing that he believed in, that he thought was necessary, is you need to allow all formerly subjugated peoples the freedom of self-determination. They decide what kind of government they want. If we decide for them, if we impose on them, it ain't going to work. Those are what Roosevelt believed in. Unfortunately, Stalin did not. Stalin believed in unconditional surrender. He's absolutely okay with that. All right, I have to do something here for Bruce. One. Okay, apparently, who can see this? I guess I'm not sure how I answer him. I'm not sure how to answer him either.
Okay. You need to go to chat.
Yeah, I'm looking for chat. Wait a second. Here we go, I found it. All can. And do I have to hit something to send it, Mom? I wrote we all can.
You got him there?
Yeah.
Real cool.
¿Y dónde está el We all can. No veo.
I thought he was calling him. I don't know if that will help.
No sé cómo lo mandar. Pone así, yo qué sé, no sé. We all can.
My father is calling Bruce. I don't know if that'll help.
Say that again?
My father is calling Bruce. I don't know if that'll help.
Well, he can tell him if he can get out of this chat. Because I'm
I
not sure
don't
how
know
to send
why.
it. I typed it, but I can't send it.
That's weird. Where is the chat?
Okay.
I have no idea.
All right. Well, we'll work, again, the glitches we will work out. At any rate,
You're on. And your TV isn't on.
okay,
That's the right-hand side of the computer.
all right. All right, now we're going to get to the Soviets' objectives. One, they believed in unconditional surrender. They believed in having an occupying force. That was the only point where they agreed with the FDR. What they also believed in, however, was they wanted very much punitive reparations. Their economy was destroyed by this war. They wanted to take all the money they could out of Germany and rebuild their own economy. And they also believed that a weak Germany was beneficial to the Soviet Union, and a weak Europe was also beneficial to the Soviet Union. So they were absolutely fine with punitive reparations. And if Germany fell apart, that's fine. If Western Europe fell apart, that's even better. It puts the Soviet Union in a more secure place in the world, and they were all for that. Now, the third thing that they wanted is their main goal out of winning the peace was actually gaining a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. If you think about Russian history, Russia had been invaded 3 times from Europe, from Napoleon invading, and then in World War I, they were invaded by the Germans, and now in World War II, again, invaded by the Germans. And part of the problem was Eastern Europe had governments that were unfriendly to Russia, didn't like Russia. So when the invading army came through their country, they just waved and said, come on through. And what the Soviet Union wanted was a buffer zone. They wanted these Eastern European countries to be friendly to the to Russia. And if an invading army came through, block their path. Again, their concern was not all the terrible things that FDR worried about. Their concern was, we don't want to get invaded ever again. And if we can put up a wall, a buffer zone through Eastern Europe, then so be it. That's our best solution. Now, if you're going to put that kind of buffer zone up, it means you're putting in puppet governments. You're installing governments that you can control. And that is the exact opposite of FDR's principle of self-determination. But Stalin doesn't care about that at all. It matters not to him at all. And for FDR, this was sacred. That was the one principle that was sacred to him. And for it to be violated by the Soviet Union as part of their peace agreement was something that he would have very, very difficult time tolerating, and very difficult time explaining to the American people how they could let the Soviet Union do these things. So we can see that they are in complete, oh, and then there's one other part of it. Part of the Soviet Revolution, the Russian Revolution, was the belief in the need to the global expansion of communism. It's a system that we need to transmit to all the rest of the world. And that was probably what frightened the West more than anything. But it had gone dormant. The Depression was a hard time for everybody. While they were fighting World War II, the idea of expanding communism around the globe was off the table. It wasn't even under consideration because you only had so many resources. So now that when the war comes to an end, the idea repeats itself. Wait a minute, let's get back to our original idea of expanding the impact of communism around the globe, of spreading it, of creating spheres of influence that would ultimately threaten and destroy capitalist democracies. And obviously, if you are a capitalist democracy, as the United States and Great Britain and France are, that's an idea that is anathema to you, something that you cannot accept, something that you would do anything to stop. This is them trying to come together. And again, you can just see, it's just impossible for them. Again, you just want to think, I just give a list of cities where the big three got together trying to figure out how do we fix these problems. They met in London, they met in Tehran, they met in Casablanca, they met in Cairo, they met in Yalta, they met in San Francisco, they met in Potsdam, and a half dozen other cities. And at the end of each of those meetings, they hadn't resolved almost any of these issues. They kind of agreed to let things work themselves out down the way. We'll figure some things out. Actually, that's maybe the American and the British point of view. The Russians is, we're going to outlast them. We're going to outwait them. We're not going to accept their solutions to these problems. And ultimately, we're going to win. So again, it's a very, very tenuous chance at peace. Now, there's almost an interruption in this story. And the interruption is Harry S. Truman becomes president of the United States. If you had said to anybody in 1938, one day Harry Truman's going to be president, they would have said, who? Harry Truman was one of the most obscure congressmen. He then became a senator. And the only reason he got elected congressman and then senator, there was a corrupt political machine in Missouri, the Prendergast machine. And Mr. Prendergast knew Harry and said, would you like to be a congressman? And Harry said, how can I be a congressman? I've never run for anything. I don't have a campaign plan. I don't have the money. Don't worry. If we put your name on the ballot, you're in. They put his name on the ballot. He was in. And they made him senator eventually. And then in 1944, there were about a half a dozen candidates for Roosevelt's re-election campaign as vice president, for vice president on his ticket. Harry Truman wasn't one of them. But everybody else had a flaw, a reason that FDR would not take him. And they said, Harry Truman, nobody even knows who he is. He's not going to be a drag on the ticket. We'll put him on. Now, again, this is a man who's going to become president of the United States. He's a high school graduate. He was a failed businessman. He had opened a haberdashery store and it went broke. What are his qualifications? And then when he becomes president, Roosevelt doesn't like him. Harry Truman is, if you've seen the show Veep, the vice president who was put in an office and the door is locked and said, don't bother us. That was Harry Truman. He didn't know about the Manhattan Project. He found out when Roosevelt died. And the Secretary of State said, Mr. President, we need to have a meeting. We got to tell you something that you don't know. And that's when he found out about the atom bomb. He didn't even know there was a program in existence to build one. He didn't know about any of the negotiations going on in all these conferences. He was kept on the outside. It's a little bit in our own lifetime of Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson had knew everything. But John Kennedy didn't like him and kind of tried to keep him separate. With Harry Truman didn't know anything and wasn't told anything. And he enters the presidency at a very monumental time in American history and has to find everything out on the fly. Now, one of the interesting things about the character of these two men, FDR and Truman, FDR would overthink things, make a decision, back off of the decision, rethink the decision, promise to follow through on the decision, back off because he was worrying about the politics of the decision. And he had a hard time making a hard, firm decision. Truman was the opposite. He would make a decision. Tell me what you know, tell me what you need, and I'll make a decision. His Secretary of State in a letter once said, I would go into Harry Truman's office with 15 issues that needed deciding. We talked for 20 minutes and he made 15 decisions. Now, we can argue with some of his decisions. His was the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Did it save lives because it ended the war in the Pacific sooner? Morally, was it a good and right decision? But he was a man capable of making decisions and making them quickly and making them firmly. And if he made a decision, the decision was made. That was his character. Well, I'm just going to read you a list because this is stunning. A man who had no idea of what issues were on the table for the presidency. This is just a partial list of what hit him in his first 4 months in office. Berlin falls. How do we handle that? You know, it's a military decision when you're trying to take Berlin. Once it's fallen, it's a political game now. How do we organize the occupying government? What are our demands to? That's all politics. Then Germany surrenders. That's even bigger. How do we handle this? How do we negotiate with the Russians over this? Then they liberate the death camps. And for a lot of Americans, I mean, there were people in government circles who knew what was going on there, but most Americans did not. And all of a sudden, this reality is thrust onto the world. Then we captured a lot of the German leadership command. Harry Truman is going to make the decision for the Nuremberg trials. These people don't get away with what they did. They committed war crimes. Well, that's really the first time in history that such a decision has been made. And that's a monumental, a huge decision. Then we are firebombing Tokyo. It was one of the things that is frightening about World War II is that it was all out war. And really what is meant by that term is in the standard understanding of war, it was soldier against soldier, army against army. In the new conception, the modern conception of war, civilians were targets too. So you would bomb Tokyo, just as Hitler bombed London and as we bombed Berlin. The idea is if you can frighten off the civilian population, the government will lose support, and the army, the government will fail, and then we win. So we're firebombing not just Tokyo, but all major cities in Japan. Two cities that we had not firebombed were Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And they would be the ones who would receive the atomic bombs when they were dropped. Just an odd story I read once. In the original list of the city to be bombed first, which ends up being Hiroshima, it wasn't supposed to be Hiroshima. It was supposed to be Kyoto. Mm-hmm. And of the generals in the room making these decisions, these military decisions, one of them said, my wife and I visited Kyoto. It was such a lovely city. Let's not bomb that one. And so they said, okay, second on the list is Hiroshima. And I mean, when history turns on such ridiculous matters, and you're dealing with a bomb blast that will literally decimate a city, that 100,000 will die almost in the immediately or in the immediate aftermath of it. That's a gigantic decision. And then Truman will make the decision to drop a second bomb. Nagasaki. And that's where a lot of people have trouble with his decisions. Okay, but also we have the Battle of Okinawa. We have the first atomic explosions. When Truman finds out about it, he's told, we're close to the point where we're going to have our first test cases to see if the bomb works. And within a few weeks, he's told it does. And then shortly thereafter, he makes the decision to use the weapon to end the war in Japan. And then you've also got the Cold War already beginning, and already an arms race beginning, because dropping the bomb, it was understood the Soviet Union was going to get a bomb as soon as they could. The arms race was really underway the minute the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The Soviets were not going to allow America to be the only country to have that. And obviously, one of the fears that we have in the modern world is nuclear proliferation. How many countries are going to get it? Are rogue states going to get it? The technology is not all that complicated. The material, the fissionable materials are expensive and relatively rare, but it is, Iran will be next to get it. North Korea already has it. Who will be next after that? There will be more. It is not going to stay at the 9, 10, or 11 that have it at the moment. It just won't. But we had hoped it would stay that way for a while. Okay. I just want you to be stunned by what Truman had on his plate. Coming out of the blue, new to everything, and he had gigantic, monumental decisions to deal with. And the fact is, you could argue that he was the most impactful president of the 20th century because of the decisions he had to make, using the atomic bomb. And his Truman Doctrine at the end is really going to finalize what the Cold War is about. The Truman Doctrine essentially says, if any country is threatened by internally or externally by an authoritarian regime, the United States will come to their aid, militarily and or economically. Well, that's Korea, that's Vietnam, that's Latin America, that's the Middle East. Everything that has dominated my lifetime comes out of Truman's issuing the Truman Doctrine.
Does that include Ukraine?
Everything. One of the things is we have decided, and it's understandable, that we would like to have our wars, but without Americans getting killed. So if we can send drones, we'll send drones. If we can send, special ops people in to do a small operation and take out somebody, we'll do that. We are a little gun shy of getting into any more wars, because one of the things about wars in the Cold War and post-Cold War period, they never end. World War I was from 1914 to 1917. World War II was 1939 to 1945. We were in Afghanistan for over 20 years, and getting out was such a mess. And you could easily imagine an alternate version of the Biden administration where they don't pull out, and we're there for another 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, whatever it turns out. Wars just don't end anymore. But we try and keep them as cold as we can, because we don't want to lose American soldiers. But theoretically, it does include the Ukraine. We could absolutely make that decision and do it. It's within the Truman Doctrine. We haven't had a president willing to pull that trigger. But do they have the authority to pull that trigger? Yes, they do. And again, all last month, our discussion was on American isolationism. We didn't want to be involved in these things. We wanted to if the world is going to be a mess, let it be a mess on its own. We'll buy and sell things to and from them. We'll make money off of the trades. But if they want to get into wars and they want to kill each other, let them do it. We're not going to be a part of it. Now we are essentially saying in the Truman Doctrine, if we think that there is it starts with Greece and Turkey. There's communist rebellions going on there. We think Soviet Union is fomenting and supporting them. And we say, normally, our prior history would have said, well, that's internal to Greece, that's internal to Turkey, that's regional. We don't get into that mess. Truman says, we get into that mess. And that the impact of that Truman Doctrine, I think it makes him the most impactful president of the 20th century because it has dominated our foreign policy. And, you know, I know that after World War II, FDR wanted us not to be isolationist anymore, that we had to join the UN. Like we had failed to join the League of Nations after World War I. We had to get into the UN and we had to take our leadership role. But the Truman Doctrine took it 4 or 5 steps further, and it made America the military interventionists of the 20th and 21st centuries. And one of the realities is when you enter into a war and you don't have an exit strategy, you don't know how to get out. And you end up, again, we stayed in Afghanistan for over 20 years and people are angry at the way we pulled out. But tell me a good way to pull out. There just isn't. And that is where we are. And that is Truman. And again, if you said, name somebody in the 20th century, I think he was less prepared for the presidency than Donald Trump was. And yet he came at a monumental time when big decisions had to get made. And he was a smart man. Just because he was a high school graduate and not beyond doesn't mean he was a very smart man. And he had character. And he had a willingness to make decisions and live with the consequences. And he made big decisions. Again, the most unlikely president, and yet maybe the most impactful. I mean, you could argue FDR with all the welfare, WPA programs that he did in the 30s to help with the Depression. You could make arguments about other presidents, but Truman's on that list. And maybe in terms of our foreign policy, he's first on the list. Again, we can argue. Okay, this is the situation with the Soviets and the Americans. We're calling it the big three, but Great Britain is really a minor player anymore. They're not an empire anymore. It's the Soviets and the Americans that have to come together, and they don't agree on anything. So when a crisis happens, you can expect that things are going to fall apart. And they do. And there are 2 places where they fall apart. And these are the 2 areas that are most important in getting the Cold War going. One is Berlin and one is Eastern Europe. Now, just in terms of Berlin, just a side thought. If I asked you, I want you to write a history of the 20th century, but I want you to pick one place and tell the history from the perspective of that place. Berlin's the place. They're the center of World War I. In the Depression, that's where you see those pictures of men with trash cans full of German marks going to buy a loaf of bread. That's the Depression. They're at the center of World War II. And then the Cold War, they're at the center of the Cold War. If you want to take us from 1914 to 1989, Berlin is the place where the history of the world is being made. It's not Washington, D.C. It's not Paris, France. It's Berlin. Okay, so we look at Berlin. What goes on there? Well, Berlin has fallen, and then Germany surrenders. We have not been able to agree on very, very much in terms of how we're going to handle their defeat. What do we do next? The only thing they had agreed on was a structure for what they were going to do. They were going to divide Germany into 4 pieces. France would control the Northwest. Britain would control the Northwest. France would control the Southwest. The United States would control the South, and the Russians would control the East. And the idea was, we'll occupy them, we'll dismantle their industrial capacity, and then we'll see what we need to do to reunify them and rebuild their economy. The Russians would have nothing to do with that. They said, absolutely not. No cooperation, no communication. You do what you're doing in your section, we'll do what we're doing in our section. That makes it hard. Then there's the city of Berlin, which is the capital. It's in East Berlin. It's in, rather, East Germany. It's in the Russian section. So other Allied forces, if they want to go into Berlin, and Berlin is also divided into three sections to the three Allies and the fourth section to Soviet Union, you got to go through Russian-controlled territory. Now, at the same time, Russian is demanding reparations. And British, French, and Americans are saying, no, we already said reparations are going to destroy the German economy, destroy the Western Europe economy, and put us ready to go into the same cycle again of war, poverty, and we got to break that. Well, what the Soviet Union doing is taking their own reparations out of East Germany. They're taking all the money out of the banks that they can. They're taking all the supplies that they can. They're taking all the industrial equipment and transferring it over to the Soviet Union. And they're taking out, I guess, what in today's economy would be billions of dollars. And then ultimately, the Soviet Union says, you know, enough is enough. We're closing off Berlin. Nobody can come in. We're blockade. It's the Berlin blockade. Basically, they say nobody, in order to get to Berlin, you got to go through our controlled territory. You're not coming through. Well, there are 2.5 million people in the parts of Berlin not controlled by the Soviet Union who don't have access to food, don't have access to medicine, don't have access to any other necessary supplies. That's when we have the Berlin airlift. And the Soviet and the Americans largely, but the Allied forces airdrop food, medicine, supplies into Berlin for the better part of a year before the Soviet Union finally relents. And this was 1948, and allows Allied troops to come into their sectors of Berlin. But of course, all of us remember in, I think it was 1961, Soviets put up the Berlin Wall, which is probably the enduring symbol of the Cold War, and didn't come down until 1988, 1989, right in there. A lot of tragedies occurred in and around that wall. It's one of those horrible monuments. And when Trump was talking about building his wall along the border with Mexico, a lot of people were making connections between that wall and the Berlin Wall. Obviously, a very unflattering set of comparisons. Okay, so that's what's going on in Berlin. Now we got to move to East Germany, Eastern Europe. The situation in Eastern Europe is actually more serious and more impactful than what's going on in Berlin. Again, you have to remember, if FDR's greatest goal was to create conditions that would allow for economic well-being and an ability for people to determine their own future and to break that cycle of war and poverty, that wasn't what was important to the Soviets. What was important to the Soviets, and it's their history, they'd been invaded 3 times. And they said, we are not going to be invaded a 4th. And the most important thing we need to get out of this peace is a guarantee that we will not be invaded again. And the only way to guarantee that is to take a strip of Eastern Europe and say that's a buffer zone. And so they install puppet governments in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Hungary, and in parts of Poland. And the United States is saying, no, self-determination. And the Soviet Union is saying, we want you to recognize these governments as legitimate, and they are our protection against invasion, because of an invading army to get to us has to come through them. And they're going to put up the first barrier. And so that is a non-negotiable for them. They threaten to derail the creation of the UN unless the United States will recognize these countries as full and legitimate members with full and equal voting rights. And you know, it's a stalemate. And that almost a definition of what the Cold War is. We're trying to say, no, you can't. And they're saying, yes, we will. And then the next question is, well, what are you going to do about it? but nobody wants to take that next step. Again, you have to think after World War II, every country almost in the world, but certainly in Europe and in Asia, had been destroyed by World War II, with two countries really standing strong, the United States and the Soviet Union. We had shown an unwillingness to have American soldiers die. And so we didn't want to get into a war with the Soviet Union because it would really be just us against them. Britain and France do not have the wherewithal, the resources to do much in that fight. This time we'd have to carry the fight. And it would be a fight that would lose. We'd suffer tens of millions of losses. And that's an unthinkable thing, and politically an impossible thing. The Soviet Union doesn't want to do it, but if Stalin decides to do it, they can. So that's the situation there in the East, in Eastern Europe. And then we're just going to see a continuation where Stalin is going to also take parts of Finland, parts of the Baltic states, and install his puppet governments there too, until he's got a huge sphere of influence and a growing sphere and the protection that he needs from it. It's at about this time that Churchill is going to make his famous Iron Curtain speech. He's in Missouri with President Harry Truman by his side, and he says, I think it's from Stettin in the Baltic states to Trieste on the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Some people date that as the beginning of the Cold War. And that iron curtain remained in place for 50 years. Again, devastating set of events going on there. And Eastern Europe, if we were going to start a World War III, that's what it was going to start over. Because if we held, and we stated that we held, the principle of self-determination as the one inviolate principle that we would not allow the Soviet Union to violate, they were violating it. They were violating it openly and in multiple places. But we did not go to war. But again, World War III was such a scary prospect, especially with nuclear weapons being involved. And unfortunately, if we did go to war, it would probably have been in the late 40s. Soviet Union's had a bomb already. They got it in 47. So would the two big boys have used the bomb? I think they might have. I think that's at least a frightening, realistic possibility. And then how does the world proceed? Does it become the norm that if you're going to get into a war, nuclear bombs are a reasonable option? I don't know, but it's scarily possible. Fortunately, we got through that, and there's kind of been an international agreement, generally speaking, that the nuclear option is off the table, although it's not so far off that we can't see it. That is the situation. Anyway, that is Eastern Europe. And I think it's even a bigger problem than Berlin. Berlin is maybe a little more dramatic, and Berlin drew the attention of the world a little bit more. But if we were again, I want you to think about how World War II started. Hitler in 1938 and 39 is kind of slowly marching eastward. This is before the war is declared, and taking pieces of, I'll take Austria, I'll take pieces of Czechoslovakia, I'll take some of Poland. And the Western democracies led by Chamberlain in England are saying, no more, no more, no more. And they compromise and appease until finally they said no more appeasement and declared war. If you want to think about what's going on at the end of World War II, it's Hitler's march in reverse. It's the Soviet Union moving westward. Hitler moved eastward, they're moving westward, and it's Bulgaria, Romania, it's Hungary, it's Poland. And we keep saying, no more, no more, no more. And it doesn't stop them. Now, are we going to get to that same point where we say, all right, enough is enough, we're declaring the Third World War? I think we were scarily close. And in some ways, maybe as a Cold War, a better solution than what the Third World War would have been. boy, I don't know, but a third world war would have been very, 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 very scary. All right, now where we get to is 1946 is really the turning point in US-Russian relations. We are starting to get tough with the Russians. We're stopping our compromising. We're refusing to overlook. And ultimately, what is going to happen is there are these, as I mentioned earlier, rebellions, communist rebellions going on in Greece and Turkey. And Truman stands up before Congress and delivers his address in which he issues the Truman Doctrine, which is any democracy that feels threatened either internally or externally by an authoritarian force. And by that, he meant nothing other than communism. We reserve the right to go in to help them, to save them, whether it's with economic aid or military aid, or a flat out, we'll go to war for you. We have that option. And for me, officially, that's when the Cold War begins. We were heading up towards it. The rhetoric was all there, but the Truman Doctrine got us there. I skipped a piece, which I want to get in first. George Kennan was the ambassador in Moscow, and the Soviet Union was balking on a lot of the things that the Truman administration was trying to get passed. Two of them being the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the State Department telegrammed George Kennan and said, "What's the problem here? They should be okay with this. What's going on? Why aren't they approving this?" And instead of answering their question, Kennan wrote what was called the long telegram. It was over 8,000 words. And that for a telegram is, oh my God, in which he said, here's what the world really is like in Moscow. The Russians, do not believe in peaceful coexistence with capitalism. They represent a current and urgent threat to capitalist democracies. And the only strategy that is possible is not all-out war, but containment. It's sort of like a chess game. If they move here, block them. If they move there, block them. And it's going to lead to all the kinds of series of proxy wars that we will have during the last half of the 20th century. Kennan, he basically established what the foreign policy of America was going to be for the rest of the Cold War. We would be in, the domino theory would be a ruling idea, and we would be always looking for where are the communists trying to expand here, and what can we do to stop them? Do we send in aid, military? Do we send in soldiers? Do we send in advisors? How do we handle this? And we find ourselves all over the globe. The last point to make about Truman and his Truman Doctrine is not only are the consequences all the wars that we've talked about, but that's the immediate reason for the creation of NATO. And NATO is a direct outbirth of the Truman Doctrine. And if I were to reduce NATO's mantra to one sentence, it's an attack on one is an attack on all, which means if the Soviet Union shows any aggression anywhere, we all take it personally and we all go back and go after them. And that has been the mindset of the Cold War. And it was so for about 50 years. Now, my conclusion is actually to go back to where I started here. And that is to look at the Cold War mentality versus that of the counterculture of the 60s, which is where I grew up and where I came to look, to figure out how I was going to look at the world and at world affairs. And there's a really great novel that was had an impact on me. It was Joseph Heller's masterpiece, Catch-22. If you've read the book, it's marvelously funny, but it's also very serious. The main character's name is John Yossarian. And near the end of the book, Yossarian is naked in a tree, and the officers want to give him a medal, but they can't because he's naked. And what do you pin it on? Anyway, he comes down from the tree eventually. And if you don't know what catch-22 is, catch-22 is that basically you can escape whatever troubles you're in. Only if you decide to escape them, you're not allowed to escape them. The whole idea of this is you're in the war, fighting in the war. The only way you can get out of the war is if you're crazy. But if you go to someone and say, I need to get out of the war because I'm crazy, if you're sane enough to know you're crazy, then you can't be crazy. So either you're crazy and don't know it and you stay and fight, or you're crazy and you know it, and because you know it, you can't get out. And you are caught in this trap, and it goes on and on and on. And the whole idea of catch-22 is that he's a member of a bomb squadron, and they would say 10 missions and you go home. And every time somebody got to like 8, they'd say, we're changing it to 15 missions. And if somebody got to 11, we're changing it to 17 so that you would never get out. At any rate, at the end of the book, they say to Yossarian, look, you can go home. We only ask one thing of you. Just tell us that you like us. And Yossarian can't, because he doesn't. And I think as I was growing up in the 60s, nor could I say that, because I didn't like them either. But as I have done this research for this, I think I am as critical as I ever was of the Cold War mentality. But I think I also have a deeper understanding of the catch-22 that they were all in. They were in a scenario, and I think I wrote it down here, in which you have two superpowers vying for supremacy. Each fears and distrusts the other. Each believes the other is anathema to their way of life. And each deals with the fear of nuclear war. And the only solution they could find to their dilemma was a Cold War that would last for 50 years. And it did. That's really all I have to say. If anybody wants to make any comments or ask any questions, we can do so.
Well done, Michael.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
All right.
very thorough.
Very good. Next month is going to be a hard one for me because I'm not quite sure how to do the research. It's going to be on the atomic age. But I don't want to do, as I said earlier, the Manhattan Project. I want to look at what the reality of the bomb, how it changed American society. There's a great film, Dr. Strangelove, and the whole idea, how I learned to stop worrying and love the bomb. That's almost kind of what the theme of the next month will be. There's the bomb out there. We're building bomb shelters. We're hiding under our desks in school. How long can we stay that scared? And how do we get out of that pattern of anxiety and fear? That's it.
Can I say one thing, Michael?
Absolutely.
Now, I was born a little later, as you know. I was born in 65, so
Okay.
I always joke around that I'm an elder Gen X.
Yes.
That's that. I'm the oldest of the Gen X. But when I think about the Cold War, which is kind of, that was my younger years. When I grew up and in my young 20s, it was kind of like I was used to that. Like that was.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Almost, yeah, it was kind of normal for me. And now when I see, and of course it's more in our country more than anything, the anti-vaxxers, the Republicans versus the Democrats, and it's not even a world war, it's a civil war. And I sit there and I go like, we can't even manage a country. We can't even be civil amongst ourselves. What will happen? You know what I mean? Like you just sit there and you think about the siege of Washington things like that, and you just think, my God, what will
Absolutely.
happen? And it's, I mean, of course, we all know it's a very scary and tumultuous time, but you know, one of the things that I did grow up in my young adult and teenage life was the reality of nuclear war. And almost, because, you know, I remember when I became aware of politics, it was kind of the beginning of the Reagan thing. Like that was when I began to realize things were kind of crazy. And that was pretty fun as far as the Cold War. And I used to sit there, and when I became aware of like things like nuclear proliferation, stuff like that, you just sit there and go like, okay, we've had 2 world wars.
Yeah, no. And
Someday,
yeah.
you know, someday, and you don't want to think of it, and you hope that it won't happen. And you hope that the world leaders will have some sense. But then when you see people like Trump and the nonsense with
the
just
division.
even your personal health and the health of your community, and you think, my God, what will happen? I mean, like, what's going to happen? It's terrible.
Yeah, and I see those divisions going on now as just continuations of the divisions between Cold War and counterculture. They're really almost the same groups, and it's the same degree of animosity and anger and polarization and distrust as I remember from when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, it was often the differences were generational, but now it's urban versus rural. It's, you know, we have all kinds of divisions, but the divisions are vicious in their anger towards each other.
Yeah. And I don't even understand that kind of hatred. Like, I really don't. Like, I don't get it. Like, I don't even get it. I mean, any kind of division like that and hatred like that, I don't even comprehend. How can you not understand that no matter what, it's human beings. It doesn't matter where they are, who they are, what they believe. It's so human. It has feelings, that has family. And you just sit there and go like, when are people, I don't know, I don't get it. I mean, like, I really don't get it. It's beyond my comprehension.
Well, I'll tell you something that goes beyond my comprehension. In Germany now, there is a very large neo-Nazi movement. And I would say to myself, if there is a country that would never go into that neo-Nazi fascistic mindset, it would be Germany, because of what their history was in their involvement in with the Holocaust and with all the horrors of the Hitler regime. But it's there, and it's not small, it's significant. In Western Europe, you are seeing candidates who have fascist attitudes, openly fascist attitudes, doing very, very well in elections. And again, with the history of what fascism did tearing apart Europe, you would say, well, it would never happen there again. Well, yeah.
Well, but I don't even think they were teaching about the Nazis in the German schools.
Not for a long time.
While. You know, they were just wanted to ignore that part of their history.
Oh, absolutely. In the first biography of Hitler in German wasn't written until the 1990s.
Well,
Because I think they couldn't face coming to terms
Yeah, it was
with.
too horrible.
Yes, and I understand that, but well, Elie Wiesel wrote his wonderful memoir novel, Night, and he couldn't get it published. And he would go to publisher after publisher, and they would tell him, you know, this is a great book. It's an important book. It's beautifully written. It's all of these things. But people don't want to hear those things right now, so we're not going to publish it. Because people, you know, the war was too fresh and people's feelings and memories were too alive. And there's also kind of communicates. There was a book written maybe about 30 years ago called Children of the Holocaust. And the story, the author interviewed children of Holocaust victims, not children who had been in the Holocaust, but whose parents had been. And the parents never spoke of the Holocaust,
Right.
didn't tell their kids that they were victims and survivors of the Holocaust. But all these children were having problems with depression and other mental illnesses. And it was, even though the parents never spoke out loud the words, telling them what they had been through some osmotic process, through body language, through whatever it is where communications are made non-verbally, the kids knew something terrible, something dark and terrible had been a reality that their parents had lived through. They didn't know what it was. They knew no details, but it had affected them significantly. And again, what shocks me, and it's sort of like similar to what you're saying, is after having the world having been through all of these things, how can we do it again? But there is a large, in all of Western civilization, I don't know what's going on in Asia because I don't really follow the events there. But in Western Europe and in the United States, there are large neo-Nazi groups that are flourishing and politically doing very well.
Yeah.
And one would think, no, it couldn't happen again. But it could, and it is. And I think Macron defeated Le Pen barely a few years ago to become the president of France, but his numbers are down and hers are up. So in the next election, she could easily get elected, and she is fairly openly a fascist. You know, that is where the world is right now. Yeah, I sometimes think you read history so you can understand things better. And then at the end of it, you say, I don't understand a damn thing.
Exactly.
Well, and we seem to be at an impasse with the other countries, you know, because like I brought up Ukraine, there's other countries,
Sure.
and the United States will say something, but, you know, listening to you talk tonight, I guess I didn't look at it as a start of a third world war if we put our foot down and say to Russia, no more. You know, you got to pull out of Ukraine, and you know, we're gonna do something at this point. I don't know. It's just
the lesson of the Cold War is not to have the big direct confrontation.
right.
Use other tools at your disposal, diplomatic, economic, whatever. And so when we get into wars which we think are small, contained wars. One of the reasons that Korea scared us so much, the reality was that a lot of the soldiers that we were confronting were Chinese. And the fear was, you know, we're willing to fight the Koreans, but if China openly comes into it and it becomes a war of the United States versus China with their huge population,
Right.
the cost of such a war would be an unacceptable cost. And what would we do? Would we surrender? Would we quit? What would we do? But again, we have tried in the Cold War to have our fights kind of askew. Fight in the Middle East, fight communist uprisings in Latin America, fight, but never directly confront the Soviet Union or the Russians or the Chinese, because if the big boys get into a fight, you have the potential of the destruction of the earth.
Yeah.
Because all of us have more bombs than we need to destroy all of civilization multiple times over. Yeah.
The thing that frightens me is, you know, when I think about Germany and that they did not have the ability to face what was done, that they did not have the wisdom and the strength to realize that they had to. And it's like, I was even just saying to him earlier today, no matter how dark or bright things are, you have to face it head on a personal level, on a level countrywide, on a worldwide level. You have to realize what is going on. You have to be realistic about what is going on. And sometimes, you know, some of it is beautiful, some of it is ugly, but if you try to just hide your head in the sand.
Well, one of the solutions that FDR wanted, and it's the reason for the creation of the UN, is to take nations' personal animosities out of it and have a place that you could go to adjudicate things. But if you look at the recent trend in America, you know, make America great again, it's make unilateral decisions that are in our interest and not worry about what is in the interest of the rest of the world. And, you know, and if you are a globalist, then you are you're not a patriotic American. So, yeah.
You know, I mean, to be successful as a country, I mean, I believe to be successful as a country, you have to understand that it's a worldwide community. But, you know, maybe I'm naive. You know what I mean?
Yes. Oh, no, I do. And right now, I am a little more pessimistic than I have been in, say, in the last 20 years. And I think probably the history of the Trump 4 years did a lot to make me feel that way. And then I watch over in Western Europe and I see the rise of fascistic movements overtly and growing and in acceptance and having political clout. And, you know, I mean, one of the realities is here we are in America. Okay. And one of our problems throughout our history has been racism. If you go back to the pre-1950s, the home party for racists in America was the Democratic Party. They were the Dixiecrats. They were the ones who, all of the segregationists were all Democrats. And we couldn't win, Democrats couldn't win all the elections they won without that huge voting bloc. Now it's transferred over and it's part of the Republican Party. Can we have two major parties say, you know what, neither of us wants to have that bloc as part of our constituency group? Well, the answer is, on a practical level, they are often the swing vote that makes you win the election. So they're in your party and you don't like it maybe, but you reap some benefits from it. All right. Well, I think that we will call it. We have hit 9 o'clock just about. And next month, it's going to be the atomic age. I don't know the date exactly, but it's the third Thursday of the month. And we'll work out the problems with people who didn't understand you had to sign in.
Thanks.
Sounds like a deal. Okay,
Thanks,
thank you, Michael.
Michael.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Same.
Me parece que es Thanksgiving.
No, we checked in. It wasn't.
No?
Wait a minute.